Hi, my name is Jonna and I play football for Chelsea FC and for the Swedish national team. And you are listening to the Blue Day podcast. Chelsea!
Fellow Chelsea supporters, here at the Blue Day podcast, we are delighted to welcome this individual on the show today. He is an award-winning author and one of the best journalists in the game. Here is Harry Harris. Harry, welcome to the Blue Day podcast. How are you?
Oh, great. All the better to see you and talking about Chelsea, one of my favourite subjects.
Brilliant. I thought you might say that. Well, I'd like to go all the way back, if I can, right from the very beginning. Harry, what made you decide to become a journalist in the first place?
Oh, blimey, you're testing my memory now. Let me think. Well, I actually wanted to be a professional footballer. I should imagine all kids of my age did. Wasn't very good, actually. Crap, in fact. So next best thing I thought was writing about it, and sent a few letters to the local paper, did little items and photographs of school sports days and open days, etc. And popped into in those days, no social media, no smartphone, so you have to walk the thing into the local branch office, and it was almost like I did that so often that it reached a stage where it was almost like I was walking in. I could have sat down and sat down by a desk anyway. No one would have noticed, and started work. So I could have gone to university, but I had an offer from that local paper group, and they took me to a block release course at Harlow College for 3 months at a time for 2 years. And I thought that was a better option, and just ended up walking into that local little office and started work there.
Brilliant. And it's so...
It wouldn't happen these days, though. Wouldn't happen these days.
No, I was going to say, I think you'd probably have to have a degree, or you'd have to sort of, know people within the profession, I guess, and work your way up from there. It wouldn't be as simple as, obviously, what happened all them years ago.
Yeah, well, if I was asked, every time I'm asked about how do you get into this profession, really, I think I should actually write a book about it.
Yes.
It might be a good handbook to publish, but I can't imagine anyone wanting to publish it, but you never know.
You never know. You never know, indeed. As again, you sort of said when you was younger, what team did you follow as a youngster, and who was your favourite player growing up?
Well, I've always been a Spurs fan. And when I moved here, I wanted to call the house The Lane, but my wife's a big Chelsea fan, so it's called The Bridge.
That's a good compromise.
So after writing about 20 Spurs books, my wife said, I've had enough of reading all that row of old rubbish. Can you write some Chelsea books? So I started. About 20 Chelsea books later, I'm still writing Chelsea books, so there you go.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we've got you on the show, is to sort of obviously go through some of them, not all of them for today, but just go through. There's some quite significant ones for me personally that I wanted to sort of discuss with you today and just sort of dissect your memories from them. There was one particular book that, again, meant a great deal for me personally, and that started off with the Chelsea Revolution. The explosive inside story of the amazing new Chelsea FC. It was released in 2003. Am I right in saying, Mr. Harris?
God, blimey. You can call me Harry, and yes, it probably was. It's a long time ago.
Firstly, I just would like to sort of say, did you have fun in writing this, and what were your thoughts on, obviously, how Chelsea was transformed at the time?
Well, going back to 2003, good grief. Well, at that time, I was still living in Chelsea. I actually lived in Elm Park Gardens, walking distance from the bridge. Well, my wife and I, my wife's a journalist as well, we knew Ken Bates very well, and his new partner at the time, Susanna. And we often, went out with them, dined with them, inundated with Chelsea fans, and we could never have a peaceful meal when Ken was around. He was loved by the fan base at the time. So clearly, when he sold the club, I really had much more of the inside track than any other journalist. I've probably lived through the takeover and had every nuance of it. So writing how it came about was probably the easiest thing I could have done.
What was Ken Bates like as a person? Obviously, if people obviously have this perception of him, obviously through the media, but the fact that you knew him personally, what was he like?
Well, I think we could do a whole podcast just on that question alone. But
don't give me the idea, because that could happen.
But to suffice to say that, we ended up very, very close friends, then fell out, and then became close friends again. And in fact, I could show you. He presented it to me. I was banned by Ken Bates.
I was aware, yes.
Yeah, because I did a lot of investigative journalism at the Daily Mirror, and fell upon this story about all the dodgy deals that he did when he signed all the players, and then their house purchases and all this sort of stuff. I was photographed in the Daily Mirror, locked out of the ground, trying to get back in. They thought it was funny. I didn't, but there you go. But we fell back in again, and during that, I think it was probably about 18 months I was barred from going to Stamford Bridge. He put up this sign called Harry's Bar in the media toilet. And when he allowed me back in, first game of the season, I wondered what was going on, because everyone went quiet when I went into the press room. And Ken Bates was in there, and he made a big speech and handed me the placard, which I still have. I mean, I can show it to you. Hold on,
oh, brilliant.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, what a collector's item.
That was hanging in the press room toilet for 18 months.
That's brilliant. I'll tell you what, although obviously, again, people's perceptions and what you hear through stories, but he seemed like a guy who, yes, had a couple of grudges, but he had a sense of humour as well.
Okay, a wicked sense of humour. But yes, he did bear grudges, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
I can imagine.
I've got a new Chelsea book out called The Boss. I did a Boss series of 3 or 4 clubs. And the Chelsea one in particular is about a history of all their managers, all the way through to Frank Lampard. And Frank, I've known very well for a long period of time. I called him and he did a forward for the book for me. Glenn Hoddle did a forward as well. And it was very sad to see Frank go, because in that forward he said how much he had put at risk his reputation as a player. Although I think it was no risk personally, because I think that reputation as a player will always stand. But he was very, very keen to replicate what he did as a player, as a manager. And I think given a bit more time, he would probably have done that.
Yeah, I agree.
But well worth reading is forward to the book, and it's a history of the managers from Ted Drake through to Frank. And we've just updated it with a chapter on the new guy, TT.
Okay.
And we've got a few pages at the end for the next one when he comes in very shortly.
And probably the next manager after that in about 12 months' time, probably, the way Chelsea are. But I do urge sort of the Chelsea fans who wants to know the inside story of Roman Abramovich and how that particular event occurred in 2003 when he bought the club, and all, again, sort of the rift of players that sort of came in. it's not just about that, but it's also Roman's love for football as well as, and obviously his intent to own a football club. So I personally think it's a fantastic read. So I do urge our followers to look at that book. But there are many quotes.
You've got to point out, I think you've got to point out to the Chelsea fans who are listening that these have become rare classics.
Yes,
they all sold out. They're all bestsellers. They sold out, and it would cost you a small fortune to get your hands on one now.
That is true. Harry, one particular quote that came out of the book that intrigued me while I was doing the research was Roman Abramovich made a few sort of comments after buying Chelsea. I just want to sort of get your thoughts on this particular quote. It's said, and I quote, "The English word fun sums it up for me. It is not about business. I see it as a very long-term commitment. I haven't thought about much money I'm prepared to spend. I suppose that depends on how well we play and how determined we are to win. If I feel we need to buy any particular player to get the results we want, I'll just spend more money," end quote. In your opinion, based on how he saw that back in 2003, do you think he still applies that today based on what we've seen sort of, well, quite recently in regards to if he wants to succeed, he'll spend whatever money is possible, and that includes compensation for coaches? And
I think his attitude has changed quite considerably since to that comment in 2003. But in a way, it hasn't changed. I think he's learned an awful lot about the industry in that long period of time. Mm-hmm. And if you, and obviously you have read the book, there was a lot of fans' concerns about how long his interest would last. Would it be a passing fad and he'd move on to something else because he had all other interests in different sports, Formula One, in the arts, in the theatre, and he had invested big in different areas of sport and entertainment. How long will it last? They said, if he doesn't keep winning, he'll grow tired and move on, sell up, and we'd be back to square one. And here we are all these years later, and none of that's happened. And I never saw that happening back then, I must say, as you find in the book. Mm-hmm. But, when he first came in, he was throwing money at it in all directions because he needed all these players. So he was overpaying vast amounts. And I think Torres was the turning point when, in a rush, they spent £50 million on the centre forward in the winter transfer window. And I don't think he particularly wanted to carry on that way. But then you find he spends a world record on a goalkeeper out of the blue, which goes contrary to what he's learned over all these years. It isn't how much you're spending, it's the quality of the player and the manager and how he's going to develop. You need a good manager to buy the right kind of players. And he's never settled on any manager. You see, Frank was the first non-foreign coach he'd ever selected. And from my inside track, what goes on in the boardroom there, he's always had a suspicion that the foreign coach was the better one. And that's why he's never actually appointed any English managers. And if you have to look back, when was the last one that ever won the title in this country? All the way back to Howard Wilkinson.
That's right, for Leeds United, wasn't it?
Yeah, so he's never really believed, and you look at the stats, that an English coach would be successful. So he's never appointed one. I think Frank was the exception, and he really wanted him to succeed. But I think really, even at the initial point of his arrival as a manager, deep down he thought probably won't succeed. And that's why I don't think he gave him sufficient time.
Do you think that Chelsea was trying to appease the fans by appointing Frank, or did they actually feel that Frank was the right man for the job? Because I remember with Chelsea getting rid of Sarri, a lot of fans didn't like him, me included in that. And obviously the tide was turning a little bit. The fans were getting a little bit grumpy, a little bit agitated with the way Chelsea were with getting rid of managers, season in, season out. First it was Conte, then Sarri. Do you think, looking back now, obviously with what's happened recently, that they've looked at Frank's sort of job at Derby, okay, he didn't do brilliantly. He got them to the playoff final, but he didn't get promoted. But do you feel because of the name recognition, they wanted to get the fans back on side and get Frank in and maybe see where it goes from there?
I don't think either of those were the motivation. I don't think he really is all that bothered about getting the fans on side. You know, you would like the fans on side. He is a fan. He wants to be on side with the fans, and he everything he does is not to get them on side, but it's the whole embracing thing. You know, the fans, the club, the owner, he sees it all as one. You know, it should all be as one. And he feels that the fans should be with him, that they should understand that he's trying to do things for the best for the club. So why did he pick Frank at that particular time? It's because I think he probably couldn't hire Mourinho for a third time. And, you know, the best coaches in the world were already placed in English clubs. You know, he'd missed out on Klopp. He'd missed out on Guardiola. He should have appointed Guardiola when he had the chance. He balked at the kind of money that the manager was asking. But then coaches' fees then spiraled out of control soon after that anyway. So where'd you go? You know, the best managers are at Liverpool and they are at Manchester City.
Yeah. So
it was again pot luck with another foreign coach. And people were saying, look, Frank has got it in him and probably did. And he went against his better judgment, I think.
Right. I think with what's happened, and as you say, Frank was given a task, and the fact that he sort of was managing with two hands tied behind his back, really, because he Hazard left for Real Madrid, so he was missing arguably the best player in the league. He obviously had to go with a transfer embargo, which wasn't sort of Frank's fault. That was down to the business of the club. So he had no choice but to then bring in the youth, the likes of James, Mount, Tammy.
I think you've hit on probably the reason why it swung it towards Frank, because, you know, if you do go and find the best available at that particular time, even though it would probably be third and fourth best in the world, if you do go and get the best that's available, the guy wants to come in and spend money on his new players or get his own team together. I think they saw Frank and the assistants he had with him as a link to the academy and the only option to bring on the kids. And as we know, Chelsea produce a vast quantity of high-quality kids who never ever get a chance in the first team. Yeah. And all they do is move around Europe. So it's almost, what's the point of the academy at Chelsea in developing such talent, but never using it or utilising it? And here was an opportunity because it was thrust upon them. Mm-hmm. And here was a young man who had links to the academy, his backroom team had links to the academy. They worked with the academy. It made a little bit of sense to go down that route under the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And he didn't do very badly in his first year, given those circumstances.
He did fantastic the first season because he had to integrate, as you say, the youth players that have not played for Chelsea before, you know, and even the ones that were on loan have come back. He had to gel them all together, knowing that he weren't able to bring in his own sort of players technically.
And that was his downfall. You know, when the ban was lifted and they spent £250 million, you had a very inexperienced coach dealing with so many high-profile, big money signings, all in one go, where the expectancy is not to have time to find the right formation and get them all to gel, is to hit the ground running and win the league. Because you don't spend £250 million without expecting a return. And what happened was, it was worse than it was when he hadn't spent a penny.
Yeah.
And some of the best players that he bought, so-called best players, well, one or two had problems with COVID, etc. But I think Timo Werner is the point in case. Mm. He arrives for an astronomical sum of money, nearly 60 million quid. with a great reputation, a great goal scorer for his country as well as his club. And Liverpool wanted him. And you have to question why they didn't actually take him or why he didn't go to Liverpool. And there he is, good start, reasonably good start, and then a massive barren spell, and he just seems a lost soul out of place within the structure of the team. And the theory is, well, let's get a German-speaking German coach in and sort out the German signings. It's lurching from one idea to another without giving anyone any time to actually sort something out.
Now, I've said this on previous episodes of the podcast, and I've said this to people personally, but I see this as going back to what they did with Benitez. When they hired Benitez in, there was rumours going around that the reason why he brought in Benitez wasn't because of his dealings as a coach, but it was because we had as you said before, a £15 million player that wasn't scoring. Why not bring in the coach that brought him to the country, that made him the player that he was, put two and two together and see what comes up? For me, that looked very similar to what they've done with Thomas Tuchel now. He's brought in a German coach, a German-speaking coach who knows about Werner, knows about Havertz, and tries to get them to gel to become better players. That's why I sort of see it as quite familiar.
Yeah, and indeed, when you see these first two signings, they'll be Germans.
Well, they've been linked, yes, most definitely. When you going all the way back, and again, you've done your sort of research on Chelsea. You've looked at Chelsea from all the way back from Ken Bates to Roman, and this issue with Roman buying players while managers prefer maybe somebody else. I look back maybe when Roman first brought in the likes of Shevchenko. There was obviously rumours and murmurs going around that Mourinho wasn't sort of a fan of Shevchenko. He didn't ideally want Shevchenko, but Roman was a fan of the player. Do you think that with everything that's gone on, obviously again recently with Lampard, and there's rumours that Lampard only wanted Ben Chilwell out of all the signings that were made, he only wanted Ben Chilwell, he didn't want all the others. Do you feel this model of owner wants player, so he'll get him? Do you feel that has been a detriment to why certain managers have come and gone at Chelsea, and why maybe there is no long-term stability?
Yeah, I think that's almost an impossible question to answer because, the way things work, the dynamics of signing players is not so simple. The manager can't say, look, I want Mbappe at PSG. That's top of my list. And I'm not going to give you number 2 or number 3 because that's the only one I want. Mm-hmm. And you go off and you offer 200 million and they still refuse to sell it. Mm-hmm. Then you find someone else, even if the manager hasn't put 2 or 3 as the backup ones. You're giving one. So it's not easy to sort that one out. The only thing is you've got to throw back to say Alex Ferguson's days and the managers preceding him and up to him. They chose all the players. They rang up their counterpart, the other manager, and they did a deal with the other manager. That's how it worked in the old days. So the manager picked who he wanted, and he would get in his car and he'd go up and around the country and he'd watch the player. Now you don't have to go anywhere because every single game's on TV. Yeah, and you get videos and players are bought by the data expert within the club who's done all the stats. So who knows why they buy a player these days or who picks them? It's almost impossible to tell.
Have you got any crazy stories to tell about managers that have gone sort of quite far up to try and bring in a player for their club? Because again, I've heard sort of stories about managers travelling hundreds of miles in their cars to try and persuade a player not to go to one club and to sign for them. And again, whether or not it's happened the last 20 years, is there any sort of stories that you can sort of maybe share with us about managers, again, taking other managers out for dinner and saying, oh, by the way, that player that isn't playing for you, can we have him, sort of thing?
Well, you have in recent times come into the the sphere of the super agents. These guys who control so much of the transfers these days, anyway. But I'm actually writing a book about Sir Alex Ferguson. It's a bit of an epic. It's a long, long book because he's 80 this year. And there's numerous stories in there about exactly what you're saying. And they're pretty long and there are lots of them. And they're quite fascinating. So that's one to look out for. There probably one or two Chelsea players as well.
Obviously, 2003, Chelsea brought in a whole host of players, and there was, thousands of newspaper articles that summer and even beyond about Chelsea being linked with certain players. Do you know any particular players that nearly signed for Chelsea, but for whatever reason didn't, other than the ones that obviously signed in 2003?
I think that's difficult to say because, as we've been discussing, there's a long list of potential signings. There's a long list of speculation in the newspapers and the media. It's really so much is so close anyway because the agents have so much of an input these days, and the owners and the people who are dealing with the money and directors of football we have. Abramovich tried that, didn't he? Director of football at Chelsea, to be that kind of buffer between, the owner just saying, I like the look of that player, and so we get them, which is not quite the case, but not far from it as well in certain aspects. You mentioned Shevchenko. I think that's quite interesting because I think if you're looking at, say, people like Frank Lampard, John Terry and Shevchenko, ideally he would like Shevchenko to be his future manager.
Yeah.
So I think that may well be the next step. You never know.
Can you see that then? Maybe not after two.
Yeah, I can. Obviously John Terry would fancy it, wouldn't he? But I think it's more likely if he's going to go for someone like that, it would be Shevchenko.
Interesting, because he's the Ukrainian national manager as well, isn't he, at the moment, Shevchenko? So
gained some experience.
Yes, exactly. One of the bits out of the Abramovich Chelsea diary that obviously came out around about the same time, 2003, 2004, there was one bit that I wanted to sort of discuss with you in entirety, and that was the details of Chelsea signing Ian Robben from under Manchester United's noses. Not sure if you sort of specifically remember that, but it was a signing that really, as a Chelsea fan, went under the radar of a few because not many people knew who Ian Robben was on the global scale of things. But obviously in the book, it sort of mentions that the United officials gave the player a tour of Old Trafford. And a few weeks later, obviously, United find out he signs for Chelsea. This is something that happens with a lot of clubs sort of within the last 5-10 years now, isn't it? That a certain club will look at a player and then another club will come in under the noses, because it's quite similar to Willian with what happened with him, that Tottenham were linked with him and they were close to signing, and all of a sudden Chelsea sort of hijacked the deal, so to speak. Do you think that still happens nowadays with clubs, or is it more...
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Yeah, of course it does. I mean, my favourite one is Manuel Petit. Do you remember that one?
Yes.
When he was signing... for Spurs, and he went down there, they agreed terms and everything else, and then he asked the club if they could get him a taxi, and they ordered the taxi, he got in the taxi and went down a couple of miles down the road and signed there.
I remember that. I remember there was an interview that Alan Sugar did, because I believe he was the Tottenham chairman at the time. I think he might have been, yeah.
Jerry Francis was the manager, yeah.
And Sugar was fuming. I sort of seem to remember.
He paid a taxi for him to go and sign up for Arsenal. Yeah, he wasn't very happy with that.
Yeah, no, I could just sort of see whereby, clubs do have not underhanded tactics and sort of things, but it's just a case of they will do whatever it takes to get that player through the doors.
Yeah, I mean, I was just interviewing Paul Parker for this Ferguson book, and he was telling a very funny story about, he was a Spurs Spurs supporter as a boy, and he would love to have played for Spurs. He was leaving QPR, and he met Terry Venables, and he thought he was going to sign for Spurs. But then Man United rang him up and took him up to Manchester, Old Trafford, and signed him that day.
Oh,
so it happens all the time, you know. But it's interesting retrospectively when you were writing books like histories of what went on. You actually find out that the nuts and bolts and the truth of exactly what happened. It's really interesting to go through that, you know, because at the time it's just like, the team was going to sign for Spurs. Well, no, he signed for Arsenal. You don't know any none the wiser. But it's only, you know, years afterwards when everyone writes their books about it all, you find out how hilarious some of these episodes are.
Well, funny you should sort of mention that, because in one of the books, it has a name that Chelsea were linked with, and I believe it's even in the book that Chelsea were actually preparing a bid, but nothing sort of came from it. And they were linked with a certain central defender that obviously now we know has become a Premier League icon in Vincent Kompany. They were linked with him when he was at Anderlecht, and I just found that fascinating to sort of read it back on the research all these years later, knowing that it was in the book back in 2003, and this same Vincent Kompany has gone on to win Premier League titles, but, you know, will probably have a statue outside Manchester City. I just found it fascinating that, you know, again, Chelsea back in 2003, 2004 were saying, we'll buy the very best. But deep down, they were actually trying to bring in future talent. They were trying to bring in, you know, stars of probably the present, you know, there were stories about Chelsea trying to bring in Lionel Messi a few times. You know, a couple of them have come out. I think there was even a picture of Mbappe with a Chelsea shirt when he was a kid saying, I've just visited the stadium.
Indeed. I mean, they're littered with all of these. And they're all true, you know. It's only obviously when you pick up a book like that from 2003 and read it, go, my God, did they really?
Yeah.
Of course they did. But they wouldn't have had any idea how well he
No, of course.
So, you know, it's fascinating to read these books. And once you do, it's surprisingly how fresh they are. But as I warned your listeners, you're not going to get your hands on them unless you're going to pay a small fortune.
Unless you want to pay a small fortune. Probably something that has probably sort of cost a small fortune back in 2004. Harry, I'm not sure if you do remember this particular game. I do, because it was near my birthday, but it was Monaco-Chelsea Champions League. Semi-final, first leg. Obviously, in the books, it's obviously got it in detail of the build-up to it. It's got the detail of the match itself. It's got, obviously, the match description. It's obviously got the aftermath. So, again, if people who in fact, may have the book, I do urge you to go back and read it, because it, you know, looking back now, it still fascinates me to this day. Do you remember that particular game and the fallout? Because the one thing that sort of people seem to have forgotten at that point was the amount of pressure that Claudio Ranieri was on, and the amount of maybe stick he got, the criticism he got with, obviously, with the substitutions he made and the people.
Well, you might. I don't know whether you can see it. There's a picture there over my shoulder. Can you see it? There it is. Of me and Claudio.
Yes, I see it there. Yes. That's a great picture. Yeah.
So you can see it there. Yeah. There it is.
Yes.
So yes, I do. I was there at the game. It was very hard for Claudio to talk about it. I mean, he had limited capacity with his English. It wasn't bad, but we enjoyed, listening to him. But I was very close to an Italian journalist at that time who knew Claudio exceedingly well, and able to translate for me really his innermost thoughts about it at the time. And they were pretty dark, because he had become aware of the fact that Abramovich had entertained Mourinho on his yacht and offered him his job.
Was this... sorry, Harry, was this before the game in the Champions League, or was this subsequently after?
No, it was before the game.
Oh, it was before the game.
Before the game. And Ranieri found out about it. And the problem really is that the feeling was that it affected his judgment in that game. And Chelsea had the beating of Monaco, certainly over the two legs, and should have easily come through that game. But he made a number of changes at half-time, which were pretty erratic. And the team fell apart in the second half. And I don't think even to this day, people really appreciate that intensity of pressure he felt in needing to win that game. He wanted to win the Champions League, to say, why are you getting rid of me? I'm as good as anybody.
Yeah. Because I remember the game sort of quite well. I was going back on research and I was having a look on YouTube, and Monaco were down to 10 men as well in that game, which a lot of people will sort of quite forget.
It should have been quite an easy ask to go through. And that's why he thought, well, I just need to make all these changes to make sure we go through.
That's right.
He didn't need to make them at all. He just panicked.
Yes, that's right. Because he put Robert Hoof on right back, and then he would put sort of Hasselbank in midfield, and these sort of changes.
All over the place. It was just all over the place.
Yes,
and I'm the game.
And I think obviously when Monaco scored the second goal, you was probably thinking, okay, it's still 2-1. We've got the away goal. If all else fails, we'll lose this one, but we can get them back at the bridge and win. But then obviously when the third goal went in, I remember as a teenager watching the game, and I was sort of flabbergasted, thinking, what's going on here? Monaco are 10 men. We've got the better squad. And again, I remember the day after, people were lambasting Ranieri, saying he's lost the plot. And do you think that game he was doomed from that point?
Well, we had lost the plot, that's for sure. I think Abramovich was still troubled by what he should do. He made up his mind to appoint Mourinho, but he was troubled that it leaked out. He was troubled that maybe Ranieri was affected in those games. Bizarrely, he called Ranieri in to see him when the season finished to discuss potential signings for next season. So the thought was either he was still dithering about whether to sack him and bring in Mourinho, or he was just picking his brains to see what he had in mind and to see whether that's what he should do before Mourinho arrived.
Because I remember before Christmas, there was around September, October, we was even linked with Sven-Göran Eriksson coming in as manager while Ranieri was in charge. And Ranieri was being asked week in, week out, oh, Sven's been linked with your job. How do you feel about it? And, was there, again, I've got me doubts whether these stories were potentially, but was there any sort of truth in the rumours that Roman actually spoke to Sven and was trying to tempt him away from the England job to come to Chelsea?
I do. It was pretty full on the discussions between Eriksson and Chelsea. But of course, it was pretty full on at the same time with Eriksson going to Manchester United. So Eriksson was the first foreign English coach and was never comfortable with that. He was never welcomed as that. He was obviously well in demand at that point in time, and he was one of these guys that was always looking for the next chance, the big chance, and the bigger chance, and the bigger picture. And he felt the day-to-day running of a big, massive club like Manchester United or Chelsea was the path to take. And of course, the salary for an English coach at that particular time compared to what was going on in the big clubs and the way those salaries were, don't get me wrong, he negotiated the biggest ever salary for an English coach, but it was still much smaller than he would get at Chelsea or Manchester United. So his agent was Pini Zahavi at the time.
That's right, Pini Zahavi, yeah.
He was very close to Roman. And very, very much in favour of Manchester United, but very strongly linked to Sir Alex. And for me, and as you're reading my Alex Ferguson book, I think it was the realisation that Ericsson had actually signed a contract to take over from him, but changed his mind, and the reason why he ditched his first decision to retire.
That's right. I remember that. That's fascinating. In regards to the books itself, what was the reaction you got from your peers and from sort of fans alike? What was sort of like the feedback you received? Either again, probably from Chelsea itself. What was the sort of the reaction you got?
What, for writing these books?
Yeah.
Well, I think I've got a very good, strong, favourable reaction from Chelsea fans. I think they like them. They seem to buy them.
Yes, well, which is why you can't buy them now.
I mean, the current one, the inside track of all these managers, most of which I've known personally, from Ted Drake to Frank. It was published over a year ago, and it's still selling strong. It still gets from time to time to number one best-selling Chelsea books. And very shortly, it will be like all the other ones.
Yes.
So I hope you get yours for your birthday, because there aren't going to be many left.
I will definitely make sure I've got one. One book I do want to talk about, we're sort of going to fast track now a little bit, is this book is, for me, steeped in Chelsea's history from 1905 to 2005, and it's called Chelsea's Century. And the book contains insights, recollections of Chelsea's past, which includes interviews from Chelsea legends. And I'm not using that word lightly. What are your memories when you came to writing this book, and how fun was it to sort of discuss about people like Ray Wilkins, Glenn Hoddle, people as well like Tommy Docherty, who unfortunately we recently lost as well? What sort of fun memories did you have of that particular book?
Well, I mean, I got to say, all these books are fun because it's almost like a ridiculous thing to say, but and my wife always gives me a lot of stick about this, but my work is my hobby. If you love football and like football and follow it, but also I couldn't really work it out when I was very young, but they actually pay you to do this job. I know all these guys, from a personal point of view, see them quite regularly. So it is fun just to chat over old times, and sometimes they're reluctant to want to do it, but often when you sit them down or talk to them, whatever, hours later you have to try and get rid of them because
Yes.
They won't stop. They like talking about it. So and I enjoy listening.
One name that is again steeped in Chelsea's history that a lot of people, every sort of time it's mentioned, would love to hear about him is Matthew Harding. What was your sort of dealings with Matthew Harding as a journalist? Did you get on with him? Did he sort of have sort of stories to tell you? And what was sort of the relationship like on that front?
Fascinating, really, because at that point, I was back in favour with old Uncle Ken, and he was daggers drawn with Matthew. So I had Matthew on talking about, why I should be supporting him, and I had the ins and outs why I shouldn't from Ken. So it was really fun.
So you were stuck in the middle, basically, then?
Well, not really, no. I mean, my job was to gather this information and publish it in the Daily Mirror, which I did with great glee.
And obviously, again, we've lost sort of too many of these legends, really. But the likes of Peter Bonetti and Ray Wilkins, again, they would have had sort of stories that would probably last days in regards to writing and sort of, a correlating. Yeah,
well, I mean, Peter Osgood, I probably saw him a couple of weeks before he died, and he came round to see me. We had a long chat, coffee, and Peter Bonetti, I've seen him regularly. And now we've got the Paul Cannaville's in hospital having a problem. Ray Wilkins, of course, knew him very well. Tommy Docherty as well. What fun he was talking to him. It was a laugh a minute.
What was he like?
Oh, just such fun to be with. He was great company. Tell a million jokes, but if you got down to the serious sides, talk about football, the stories he would tell me fascinating. So I obviously interviewed him for the book about the history of managers, and that was hugely enjoyable, and I was so pleased that I did. Anyway, look, it's a privilege to be able to talk to these guys and to write these books. It's great fun.
The one thing that I got from that particular book, The Chelsea Centuries, was the amount of characters that have sort of come through, the club, and even sort of just come through the whole sport of football. Do you think sort of the type of characters has changed to the point where, you don't get that particular player anymore, like the maverick type that, after a game will go to a pub and sort of have a couple and then sort of go home? The players that like to have a laugh and sort of more freestyle, more relaxed. A lot of them now, it's, for me, again, looking at it as a fan, it's completely different. Is that sort of ruined football a little bit in regards to outside the game, where people can maybe more of a social aspect?
Yeah, I don't think it's changed at all. I just think it's what you just said. The attitude is the same. It's just the surroundings, the circumstances are different. So, going back all those years ago to the people we talked about, there was that drinking culture where they'd go out and they'd go and play snooker, then go down a pub and have 10 pints. And Liverpool were more successful than Arsenal because they had their drinking session on the Tuesday and Arsenal had their drinking session on the Thursday. But now it's, VIP nightclubs in VIP sections and £250 bottles of champagne and cocktails, isn't it? But it's basically the same principle. They're young boys wanting to have a nice time, and invariably we see this because of social media. They get caught out having a nice time. We see exactly what they're up to. And it's probably no different, and I'm sure it was no different because I was there then. It's no different to what it was before.
The only thing difference is no one didn't have a camera sort of years ago, did they? They didn't sort of...
The things I could have recorded were unbelievable. But, those days, there was a trust with there was a small group of us guys, senior football writers. These days is a, mushrooming media with all sorts of people going along, news reporters, feature writers, social media writers, footballers, Twitter campaign editors and all this sort of stuff. It's just so many people, you can't really know who's doing what to whom. But in those days, exactly, and the tales we could tell but never did were probably better than any stories we ever wrote in the past. Yeah. But the problem they got now is they can't escape from the smartphone and social media, and it's harder for them not to be discovered. But they're all the same as before. They're all young boys, super fit, high on adrenaline when results. They want to enjoy themselves.
Harry, the last book I want to talk about today, where next year would, quite incredibly actually, would be the 10-year anniversary of Chelsea winning the European Cup in Munich. And you brought a book out called The Roman Conquest, Chelsea, Kings of Europe 2012. It's a story of Chelsea in the Champions League. Again, I believe it is still available out there. So if you do want to find the book, I do urge Chelsea supporters to find it. It's not completely out there on Amazon, but there is available on decent bookstores. But one aspect, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show, Harry, was one aspect of your fantastic books are the stories that come out of them that you wouldn't hear anywhere else. And in my opinion, it gets your mind thinking and visualizing while you're reading it that you're actually there. And one of the sort of examples I have was when you sort of discussed quite early on in the book about Didier Drogba and the Champions League trophy with, and I quote, Drogba talked to the trophy. It was almost like a religious experience. Now, with obviously the book itself, I just want to sort of ask about the book. How did the concept of this particular book initially come into fruition?
Well, I think it's because Roberto Di Matteo, I would consider a very dear friend of mine. When we lived in Chelsea, my wife's a journalist, my wife and I would frequent his restaurants. He had first one in Hollywood Road. We went there many times, and then he took over San Frediano's in Fulham Road, and we went there as well. Wasn't as successful, I don't think, as his first one. More of a relaxed pizza bar where all the players used to go, and he invited me to the opening, and I was there with Frank Leboeuf and a few of the guys, and we got on very well. Got on very well with Frank in particular, and went out socialising with them. And it wasn't material. They knew, they trusted me. It wasn't going to go in the Mirror or the papers at the time, but it made for good material for a book. And hence you'll find that kind of unpublished material, first-hand kind of recollections that are perfect to put in the book.
For me, the book fascinates me because, as you say, it's got sort of little snippets in there about obviously the build-up and quite a bit of the behind-the-scenes issues initially when AVB took over. One of the bits in the book that fascinated me was with Andre Villas-Boas, which is in the news now with him being suspended at Marseille. At the time, Nicolas Anelka and Alex, who 2 years previous won the league with Chelsea and were quite big players for Chelsea at the time, they weren't just banished in the reserves, but they weren't allowed to park their cars in the first team car park. That sort of astounded me a little bit, with a manager who, with all due respect, was quite inexperienced at the time, treating these big name players like that. AVB certainly made his mark during that sort of tenure. Do you feel that, again, with looking back with him then to what he's doing now, has he changed at all?
Doesn't seem to.
No.
I just think that the problem with football now is that everything is acceptable if you're a winner. So if you're banishing the big names wherever you want to banish them to the reserves, and you say, well, if you're in the reserves, you go and park in the reserve car park. But that's fine, if that method works. If it doesn't work, you're a complete idiot then, aren't you? Taking that kind of attitude and alienating. You don't just alienate those two players, you alienate their mates.
Yeah.
Whoever they're friendly with in the dressing room, they're going to be moaning to, and they're going to be moaning to someone else. It creates a bad atmosphere. Not if you're winning, though. You just turn around and say, I don't care what you think about your mate, you're winning. You're getting your win bonus, you're getting your bonus for winning the trophies, and you're getting your medals. Simple as that.
I looked at obviously again, I've read the book and I was looking through the actual season review on DVD as well. And looking back on AVB's time at Chelsea, do you think that sort of particular period has damaged his career from that point? Because he hasn't really sort of done great since, has he? He had that spell at Tottenham for a little bit, and then, as similar to Frank, he spent all that money after Gareth Bale went, didn't work out, and then he left. And then since then, he hasn't sort of done particularly great. Again, in your opinion, based on what we've seen since then, did AVB's time at Chelsea damage his career overall?
Well, it should have done, but doesn't seem to have done. He seems to have got quite a few, lucrative assignments since then, with very similar results. So it's interesting. He has a fascinating CV. He's managed so many clubs in so many different countries that he's got vast experience because he obviously was managing in English football at a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking for an experienced coach, people are they have him under consideration. But some of his methods and what he gets up to, you got to think, well, it's a bit of a risk. But he does have vast experience and has had limited success, you could put it that way.
When Andre Villas-Boas was sacked in March of 2012, because it was after West Brom away, we lost the game. Whilst sort of compiling this book, did you ever think at that point that Chelsea were going to have the season, that the end of the season that they ended up having? Did you feel at that point, as a journalist, did you feel at that point, Chelsea could still do something, or was that point, no, this is going to be a complete write-off?
Well, it's funny you should say that, but it's almost like when Ruud Gullit was sacked, and only after a handful of games, and Luca Vialli comes in, and you think, good grief, they've just appointed someone straight out of the dressing room who's had a row with the manager. How's that going to work? And at that particular point in time, he won more trophies than any other manager in their history at that time. So you think, oh, could something like that happen again? But you go, no, can't possibly. It couldn't possibly. And how that happened, I've no idea.
Was you surprised that Di Matteo took over as interim charge? Was you expecting somebody else to come in?
Yes. So
really?
It was just like, wow, look at that, fabulous. It's one of the great football stories of all time, I think. To take over at that point and think, they could win the Champions League. I mean, no, who would have thought that? But he did. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why he did. He did carry the dressing room. They really, you hear that expression, they're playing for the manager. I don't understand what the hell that means. But I think in this particular case, there's a reason to believe that they did play for the manager. They did put themselves out.
Was there any names that you knew from the inside that were linked with the job while Di Matteo was in charge? Because at that point, Di Matteo was the interim manager. Was there any particular sort of stage where Chelsea were maybe looking at somebody else to come in that summer, albeit, again, they didn't know that Chelsea were going to go on to win the European Cup. Did you sort of hear any inklings about they might go for somebody with more experience, as you say, because AVB, as we've already established, didn't have the experience required?
If you look back in the book, I'm sure I've catalogued that they probably went for two or three. I'm sure they wouldn't they done?
I know it was mentioned about Guardiola, but apparently Guardiola said about he would rather do his first sabbatical because he just wanted a break from the game. And I know it said on the book about Laurent Blanc. It said about him, because I think he was the French national manager and he was still doing the European Championships that were going to be in 2012. And I believe the last one was, ironically, Jose Mourinho, but he wanted to stay at Real Madrid. No, them particular.
It's off my memory, but I think we discussed this earlier, didn't we?
Yes, we
they tried to get Guardiola, and I think they pulled out all the stops to try and get him, and he wasn't having it. But feeling they were offering him, I think they've got this feeling they were prepared to offer him something like £20 million a year to sign for Chelsea, and that's going back an awful long time. That'd be almost like £40 million a year in today's currency. And it was an astonishing amount. I think even 10 million a year was an astonishing amount, but I think they started there and just went up to 20. They were just saying it was almost like name your price.
Why do you think Guardiola never bit? Obviously, London's quite sort of a nice city to live in if you've got the money and sort of the stature of working for Chelsea. Why do you think, in your opinion, Guardiola never bit?
Because I think the guy is highly intelligent. I think he's also very astute. And, I don't think he needed to sign up for a project which included an owner that we used to 20, 30 years ago look to Spanish football and say, look at that maniac there hiring 3 or 4 coaches in one season. Who'd want to go and manage in Spain or with these clubs? And I think he just said, I don't need it. I need a project where I'm given time and consideration and bring in what I need to bring in and develop something over a period of time. Not to have the kind of pressure where I'm rushed into doing something there and then. Maybe I don't want to do. Maybe I don't want to sign this one or that one. Yeah. And I think he looked at the project at Chelsea and said, I'll wait. Do I need that money, even though it's an extraordinary amount of money? And would he have survived at Chelsea?
Probably not.
Well, probably not. No.
Probably not.
Nobody has.
Nobody has since. No, nobody has since.
Absolutely the wise decision. And the part he's taken at Manchester City and the success he's had at Manchester. I mean, the guy got it right.
That's right. Harry, one last question before we sort of do let you go. In your opinion, do you believe we will ever see a team that look down and out midway through the season, sack the manager after 8 months in charge, go on to win the European Cup and the FA Cup?
Not going to happen, is it? And should never have happened, really.
Was you there at Barcelona and Munich? Pat, you was there.
Well, where else would you be?
That must have been a surreal experience for you. Again, for someone who has followed Chelsea over the years, to see Torres go past Valdez and score the equaliser, and then with Drogba scoring that winning penalty.
Well, you are talking about someone who actually saw Man United win the treble by winning the Champions League in those extraordinary circumstances in which they did. No, I think I've seen some extraordinary Champions League finals.
No, we're not talking about Man United.
Was that unusual? Well, it was unusual, but I've seen some really unusual things going on.
No, of course.
Of course, nothing quite as unusual as that. No.
The issues, obviously, with Bayern, they were 1-0 up with, the 89th minute? And obviously United had them their 2 rare attacks, the 2 corners, and they obviously scored from them corners.
Indeed.
Harry, just again say thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. Hopefully we will sort of talk again to discuss your other books as well that obviously you have written, and also that you have written quite recently. There's the Boss book that is out from last year. Anybody that is interested in reading about Chelsea's past managers, I urge you to find the book. If you can find the books that we have discussed, if you can find them on websites, feel free to. They might cost a pretty penny, but they are worth it. Believe you me. Harry, again, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast, and we'll hopefully speak to you soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Carefree!